Our speaker this evening confesses to always being fascinated with New Jersey's history. And he's certainly written enough books and many awards and accomplishments to prove that point. Tonight, his topic follows the title of his book, The American Revolution in Monmouth County, the Theater of Spoil and Destruction. Please welcome Michael Adelberg.
First of all, can everyone hear me okay? Yes. I won't do that again. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming out. And a little bit about me. As noted, I've been researching the American Revolution in New Jersey for about 20 years. During that time, I've written a couple of books. I've had a number of journal articles. And I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with you all tonight about the county where I grew up, Monmouth County. For those of you who don't know, Monmouth County is south of here, predominantly along the Jersey shore, basically from Sandy Hook. And revolutionary Monmouth County would be what would today be Monmouth County and Ocean County. So basically as far down as Little Egg Harbor, significant shoreline. I'm going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to give you an overview of my book, The American Revolution in Monmouth County. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about local government during the American Revolution. And one of the really interesting and understudied topics is how do you go from being people who are locked out of government who are governing. And lo and behold, if I was made governor of New Jersey tomorrow, I might make a mistake or two. It's a hard job. I don't have a ton of experience. I might be very hardworking. I might be very well-intentioned. But a couple of things would likely go wrong. And if you combine that with the extremely trying circumstances of the American Revolution, well, dare I say, quite a few things might go wrong. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. And let's get into it. Okay, so first, an overview of my book. Obviously, I'm probably not doing my book great justice in reducing it to a handful of slides, but I trust I will whet your appetite and perhaps encourage you to learn more on the topic after tonight. Okay, a little bit on revolutionary Monmouth County. How we doing here? All right, I'm going to shut my eyes when I do this. Here we go. Let's try this again. John? Wouldn't be a good presentation without at least one technical challenge. That's okay, we'll try it. Okay, so first of all, Monmouth County, as I mentioned, a large geographic area. Despite being a large geographic area, there weren't all that many people there. There weren't that many people in all of New Jersey. 120, 130,000 in all of New Jersey. So Monmouth County has about 10% of the population of the state. Nonetheless, in all of Monmouth County, you have fewer people than will attend the next New Jersey Devils game. Just to put it in perspective. Significant diversity in that you have 5 distinct religious denominations, some of which were antagonistic toward each other. We have Presbyterians, Baptists, Dutch Reformed, Anglican, and Quaker denominations. Also, about 10% of the population was African American. And of that African American population, it splits roughly 50-50 between slave and free. There are no cities in the county. There are significant towns, Freehold, Middletown, Shrewsbury, Allentown in particular. Commerce goes to the two large cities, of course, New York and Philadelphia. There's agriculture, and there's also maritime activity along the shores, particularly things like oyster raking and fishing. Monmouth County before the war was not a placid place. Just in the decade before the war, you have significant agitation from two Sons of Liberty's chapters during the Stamp Act resistance. And then Monmouth County has significant land riots that close down courts and force court officials to flee for their safety in 1769 and 1770. All right. I am willing to confess. John, would you mind just doing slides for me? Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. As you can see, John has the tough job tonight. I have the easy job. Okay. Civil warfare in the county. One thing that's really important, and if there's a single thing I would ask all audiences I speak to come away understanding, is yes, there is a revolutionary war between the Continental Army and the British Army, absolutely. But there's a second American Revolutionary War going on concurrently, and that is the war between local militias and local groups of loyalists. Now, the loyalists in some parts of the state, in some parts of the rebelling colonies are not particularly numerous. But in other parts, they're very numerous. My own research on Monmouth County, in which, yes, I actually counted every individual against the historical record, court records, militia lists, loyalist lists, confiscations of property, and basically I determined that about 30% of Monmouth County residents were either disaffected, meaning at one point or another they did something that got them in trouble with the revolutionary government, from disaffected to outright loyalist, about 30% of the county's population. And frankly, with better documentation, with complete documentation, the number would have probably been a bit higher. Okay, so we have civil warfare. There are rival militias in the early years of the war. There's significant loyalist raid warfare through the second half of the war. This is after and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a later slide, but this is after the active loyalists, the people who have clearly thrown in their lot with the British, basically have to leave, and they go to Sandy Hook, which is a British naval base, or they go over to New York, Staten Island or Brooklyn in particular, and they come back, angry with guns. Several years of raid warfare. In addition, there are the so-called disaffected who stay in Monmouth County, but aren't particularly enamored with the revolutionary movement, and they continue to have a trade with British-held New York that is so prolific that it earns the nickname the London trade. And then, out of frustration, and you'll see I use the word Whig. Whig is the supporters of the revolution. Whigs are actually what they called themselves. They didn't call themselves revolutionaries. They didn't call themselves patriots. This is the term they used, so it's a term I will use. And Whig is used, by the way, because it's the party of political reform in England. Right. So that's the term that the founding fathers actually used to describe themselves. So I use that term as well. Okay, how much was the civil warfare? How prolific was it? Again, my research, in which painstakingly counted stuff, 20% of the men in the county have a documented harmful event. Harmful event could be anything from having their property confiscated, to being thrown in jail, to suffering bodily harm. If you do a little statistical sampling and project these men and family size, works out to be a reasonable estimate that you're going to have about half the families in the county have someone on either side who suffered during the war. Well battles and skirmishes, 127 estate confiscations. Remember, this is in a county with, I'll get to you in just one second. This is in a county with 12 to 15,000 people. So 127 confiscations are significant. And over 600 Monmouthers go into the New Jersey Volunteers. That's about 10% of the male population. The New Jersey Volunteers are part of the British Army. This is a formal provincial corps of the British Army, made up of Americans serving in the British Army, and hundreds more loyalist irregulars, and I'll talk a little bit about irregular activities. Here's a question.
Is that 20% number 20% of the 30%, or is it 20% of the population?
This is 20% of the gross population.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please. Thank you, John. Okay, the first stage of civil warfare are the Loyalist insurrections that begin in June 1776. Even before the Declaration of Independence is signed, there starts to be agitation against the new New Jersey government of the Provincial Congress. You have pockets of disaffection in Freehold, Upper Freehold, which would be the western part of the county, and Shrewsbury Township, which sits immediately underneath Sandy Hook. By the fall, there are Loyalist associations forming all up and down the shore and in Middletown. And then in late 1776, at that same time that the British are sweeping through New Jersey and the Continental Army is pushed across into Pennsylvania, Monmouth County essentially, for roughly an 8-week period, has a functioning Loyalist regime over most of the county, and it is referred to within the documents as the Tory ascendancy or the Loyalist ascendancy. And you read the veterans of the Revolutionary War have to write narratives long after the war to get a pension, and their pensions we'll talk about, this being the period where the militia laid down its arms, this being the period of the Tory ascendancy. The British appoint commissioners. The commissioners start pulling people together. They have to renounce the Continental Association, sign British loyalty papers. If they don't, they get fined. They get their guns, wagons, and horses confiscated if you won't sign a loyalty oath to the British. Then, Battle of Trenton happens. After the Battle of Trenton, the Brit and the Princeton immediately after, what happens? The British pull back across New Jersey again. Continental Army comes in, and a regiment of Pennsylvanians and a regiment of Delaware Continentals come into Monmouth County and fight what I call the First Battle of Monmouth. Now, everyone here, I trust, has heard something about the Battle of Monmouth. Okay, Battle of Monmouth, June 28, 1778, Washington and Lee, and okay. On basically the exact same spot of land as the more famous Battle of Monmouth, on January 2nd, 1777, so a year and a half earlier, 200 Continentals march just past Freehold and engage a body of, depending on whose account you like more, 200 to 300 Loyalist militia. The Loyalist militia, I'm assuming, the documentation isn't great, but I'm assuming Loyalist militia, not particularly well disciplined, probably not particularly well armed, probably some of them don't want to be there. The Continentals fire on them. The battle lasts about 15 minutes. The Loyalists disperse. After that, the Continentals continue to push east. They topple a Loyalist association in Middletown. They topple another one at Shrewsbury. And by the end of January, Monmouth County is back in the hands of the Whigs. The quintessential insurrectionary, Colonel George Taylor. George Taylor was from a prominent pre-war family. His father, Edward Taylor, had served in the Royal Assembly of New Jersey for a number of years. In the beginning of the formation of the Whig militia in early 1775, George Taylor was named the first colonel of the Monmouth County militia, and the senior colonel as it continues to grow. As the war starts, George Taylor is put in charge of the state troops that face the arriving British Armada at Sandy Hook. George Taylor writes furious letters to the New Jersey government, basically saying, I have 60 men and no guns, and I'm facing across at Sandy Hook, where there are 25,000 British soldiers and hundreds of cannon. Can you help me out here? The New Jersey government was not in a position to help out George Taylor a great deal. Probably this was a period of time where George Taylor begins to think he's maybe on the wrong side. So George Taylor begins, in late summer of 1776, begins to hold secret communication with some of the forming Royalist associations along the shore. No one knew at the time, but unfortunately some of the letters show up in Peter Force's American Archives compilation, so we know. George Taylor continues to grow increasingly disaffected, and finally, in November of 1776, as it looks like the Continental cause is falling apart, George Taylor declares himself a neutral. He writes a letter to the governor of New Jersey, basically saying, I will not take an oath to the continent, and I declare myself inactive. When the Loyalists take over that period of the Tory ascendancy, George Taylor's uncle, John Taylor, becomes one of the Loyalist commissioners. George Taylor at that point is appointed colonel of the Loyalist militia. When the Loyalist militia gets dispersed at that first Battle of Monmouth, Taylor and some of the other active Loyalists go behind British lines. By June 1777, Taylor is leading raids from Sandy Hook and Staten Island back into Monmouth County. Next slide, please. Okay, another chapter of my book deals with African American Loyalists. There were significant racial tensions throughout New Jersey and New York, but particularly Monmouth County prior to the Revolution. In fact, the first campaign of the Monmouth County militia in 1775 was not against the British. It was against a restive African American population where they confiscated guns from African Americans, slave or free. That population, for whatever reason, was thought of as dangerous, restive. The guns were confiscated and they declared a curfew. Again, not just on slaves, but on freedmen. The first campaign of the Monmouth militia. As the war begins, Sandy Hook, a British naval base, becomes a magnet for runaway slave activity. I document 30, I have to double check my own records, but in the 30s of Monmouth County slaves who run off to Sandy Hook over the course of the war. And again, documentation is not particularly good, so the real number no doubt will be higher. On Sandy Hook, the runaway slaves, and they're not exclusively from Monmouth County, they're coming in from other parts as well, establish a semi-permanent settlement called Refugee Town. Refugee Town has 50 to 70 shacks and tents, according to one report. And the African American Loyalists turned to raiding back into the county. In 1780, they become well organized, and in the early days, they are working under white officers, but in 1780, they become well enough organized and get enough support from the British to actually form into their own association. It's called the Black Brigade, and it's led by someone who's called Colonel Ty, but he doesn't actually hold a formal commission in the British Army. Colonel is something of a nickname. In any event, the Black Brigade launches a half dozen raids in 1780 alone back into Monmouth County. They were very good at taking significant Monmouth County leaders prisoner. They kidnapped a state legislator. They kidnapped a lieutenant colonel of the militia. They kidnapped 2 captains of the militia. They kidnapped a magistrate and other lesser officials. In addition, they kidnapped lots of horses and cows, because horses and cows become their means of support. The British Army has to feed itself. It's garrisoned into New York. It can't feed itself. You bring back a cow, that is significant money from the British commissary. And sometimes these loyalist raiders actually earn the nickname of cowboys because they are stealing cows and horses from the farms. Just a little bit more on Colonel Ty. He, in all likelihood, was the slave Titus from Shrewsbury, New Jersey. He ran off early in the war. In the early years of the war, he served as a guide to parties of white raiders, probably became very skilled at leading small parties of men at night. Again, several raids highlighted in June 1780 when he led 3 very successful raids. He became a legendary character, and the same way perhaps the George Washington slept here legend, there are lots of places that now claim George Washington slept here. Some probably are a little bit fanciful. Colonel Ty starts showing up in amazing places in Continental documents. I suspect he was not everywhere he was claimed to be, but he becomes something of a legend. And no doubt a very successful partisan, probably the most successful of all the partisans who operated out of Sandy Hook, but nonetheless, it becomes something of an apocryphal character. Finally, he leads his boldest raid. He goes way inland. He's not just hitting the outskirts and the coastal areas. He goes all the way into Colts Neck, 10 miles inland. The goal is to kidnap Joshua Huddy, who's a captain of the state troops. Huddy is hated by the Loyalists because of his role in hanging the Loyalists without trial. And he captures Huddy. But in the process, of course, if you're going to go all the way inland, you got to take some cows, because that's your means of support. So it takes a long time to load all those cows onto barges and get back. During that lengthy process, the militia shows up. There's a skirmish on the beach. Ty gets shot in the arm. He does escape, but the wound becomes gangrenous and he dies in September 1780. And the Black Brigade is never nearly as effective after 1780. Next slide, please. The Continental Army. Again, one of my essays in the book. The Continental Army, let me pull back. Standing armies, whether they be American or British, are distrusted by the population at large. Standing armies consume resources. Standing armies take your chickens because they have to eat. Standing armies cause mischief. They trample your garden. Americans don't like standing armies. Even their own standing army they don't particularly like. The people of Morristown did not enjoy a fantastic relationship with the rank and file of the Continental Army most of the time. While this clearly is an area that had tremendous numbers of Continentals, Monmouth County had Continentals as active combatants in a different role. Continentals first come into Monmouth County in 1776 to suppress the Loyalist associations. Pennsylvanians and the New Jersey regiment of Colonel David Foreman, they are generally not successful. One of the frustrating things about the disaffected on the Jersey Shore is that, first of all, they're spread out. They don't live in a big town. They don't wear signs saying I'm disaffected. So they're hard to find. And when the Continentals come through, they're great citizens. Huzzah for the Continentals! They're hard to find. So, they're generally not effective. When the Pennsylvanians and Delaware Continentals come in, though, in January 1777, what's the difference? This time, the Royalists are formally mustered. They're out in the open. And the Continentals are better armed, and the Continentals rout them. And restore order. By late 1778 and into 1779, that London trade, that illegal trade across Raritan Bay and up through Sandy Hook is becoming so prolific that Governor Livingston and George Washington become convinced that Monmouth County is a key to feeding the British Army. And if you want to make the British uncomfortable, you have to cut off the London trade. So, Washington commits to sending in regiments of Continentals. This turns out to be a difficult period of time for the Continentals who come in. There's a map, Pulaski's Legion actually suffers a massacre in southern Monmouth County at Little Lake Harbor in October 78. And then there are cantonments of Pennsylvanians, Marylanders, and Virginians in early 1779, all go badly. I'll talk a little bit about the Virginians in particular, under Colonel Benjamin Ford. Numerous disorders. They vandalize the Christ Church at Shrewsbury. They are rowdy and sloppy at the Allen House Massacre, and Corporal's Guard of Continentals get surprised and captured. They mutiny. Meanwhile, one of their captains, who is stationed at Tinton Falls, writes letters back home describing his time enjoying the company of the fine ladies in the area. So the discipline isn't terrific. And then the opportunity to be an effective military force comes on April 25th. The British launch a two-pronged attack. 300 British regulars land at Rumson. 400 Loyalists land on the Highlands. The goal is to link up at Tinton Falls, where the Continentals are headquartered, and capture the Continental Regiment of Benjamin Ford. Ford's men, however, on the first news of the landing of the enemy, retreat. They don't stay. They retreat all the way inland to Colts Neck, and the raiders have a run of the land. And afterward, the locals are very, very upset and disappointed with the support they received from the Continentals. And in one of the great understatements of any letter I've ever read from the period, one of the militia colonels writes very diplomatically to the governor of New Jersey, Colonel Ford is censured by some for his conduct. After this, Washington becomes convinced that trying to secure eastern Monmouth County is a lost cause. He writes a letter to the governor in which he concludes of his own forces they do rather more harm than good, and the Continentals leave the county. A final footnote, though, is in 1780, Continentals return under Light Horse Harry Lee, a mobile elite unit, but they don't get stationed on the shore, they get stationed in Freehold, and they do quick movements out to the shore and then come back inland for safety. And Lee's unit actually does extremely well. Lee is responsible for killing one of the most hated Loyalist partisans, Louis Fenton, and he also, one of his captains, the Captain Peyton, launches a very successful raid on the British base at Sandy Hook. So there is, I guess, something of a happy ending to the story. Next slide, please. The retaliators. Monmouth County is home to a significant vigilante society. In fact, there were large vigilante societies in the Carolinas. To the best of my knowledge, nothing like the retaliators exists anywhere else in the world. I could be wrong, I haven't studied every locale, but I'm not aware of a comparable association anywhere in the northern colonies. Twice early in the war, Loyalists are killed without trial. Stephen Edwards and James Pugh, two Loyalists, are both killed under mysterious circumstances, and the killers are not brought to justice. The county, the Whigs in the county face incredible pressures. They are being kidnapped by Loyalist raiders. They are having their livestock taken from them. They're having their homes burned. And their enemy is safe behind British guns. Incredible frustration. And many of the Whigs move toward eye for an eye vigilante justice. In July 1780, they signed something called the Articles of Association for purposes of retaliation. 530 signatures, more signatures than any other document from the county during the entire war. Vigilante Society, they elect a board of directors. The board of directors declares who will be an object for retaliation. Basically, the premise is anytime a member of the society loses something, equivalent losses will be inflicted upon the enemy. The problem is they can't get to the enemy. So they find proxies, usually the kin who stayed home, or people who are maybe London traders, people who are suspected, people who were maybe Loyalists early in the war and are now trying to lay low, Quakers who won't serve in the militia. They're going to they find people, but it doesn't go through the courts, and they begin to exact their own vigilante justice. There is opposition, even within the Whig community, to what the retaliators are doing. In fact, a rival society is created called the Whig Society. The state legislature censures the retaliators, calling them a combination to trample all law underfoot. Meanwhile, though, no one really has the power to stop them. I mean, is the Continental Army going to march in and stop these people? The Continental Army is kind of busy. And the belief is that the Continental Army exists to battle a foreign enemy. The Continental Army is not a police force. So, the retaliators go forward despite the opposition and the censures from the state government. Despite local opposition, they continue. There's also a Loyalist group that gets started at about the same time called the Associated Loyalists, headed by William Franklin, the last loyal governor of New Jersey. And the articles that establish the Associated Loyalists are a perfect mirror image of what gets going in Monmouth County for the retaliators. Same eye for an eye principles. And the Associated Loyalists and the retaliators get a whole tit-for-tat thing going. And one group lands and kidnaps two people. The next group kidnaps two people. Finally, in April 1782, 6 months after Yorktown ended the war, right? We all learned Yorktown ended the war. 6 months after Yorktown, An associated loyalist party takes a captured Monmouth militia officer out of jail, brings him over to what would today be the Atlantic Highlands, without no trial, mind you, hangs him, leaves the body swinging with a note that proclaims the hanging of Captain Huddy, the same guy Tommy captured, by the way, 2 years earlier, but was subsequently released. Leaves the body swinging with a note that says, "We will hang man for man with you." And the last line of the note says, "Up goes Huddy for Philip White." Philip White being a loyalist who had been captured and killed under mysterious circumstances 2 weeks earlier. The brazenness of the Huddy hanging creates a diplomatic bonfire. Washington resolves that if Huddy's murderer, Richard Lippincott, formerly of Shrewsbury, if Lippincott is not turned over to continental authorities, Washington is going to hang a British soldier selected by lot, a British officer of equivalent rank selected by lot. Someone named Charles Asgill is selected, and Washington writes British High Command that he will hang Asgill if Huddy's murderer is not turned over. What happens is it goes all the way up the diplomatic chain. It actually briefly threatens the Paris peace talks. And finally, Count Vergennes of the French government, the French foreign minister, gets involved and basically writes through the diplomats in Paris, basically, you gotta let this go. And ultimately, Guy Carleton, the commander-in-chief now after Henry Clinton, Guy Carleton grounds the Associated Loyalists. After this, Guy Carleton is here to try to simmer things down. He puts the Associated Loyalists out of business. Washington backs off on hanging Asgill, and things defuse a little bit. The chair of the retaliators, Colonel David Foreman. Colonel David Foreman was an early and active patriot, commanded a regiment of flying camp in 1776. In 1777, he acts as something of a martial law commander in Monmouth County. Monmouth County is completely dysfunctional at this time. There is no civil government. So Foreman claims to have martial law responsibilities transferred to him by Washington. If you read the note that Washington wrote to Foreman, it's kind of a broad interpretation. But nonetheless, Foreman does remarkable things in this period, including using his own troops as laborers at salt works that he owns, including exiling several loyalist women to New York without any due process, including hanging the captured loyalist Stephen Edwards without due process of the law. I could go on. The New Jersey legislature censures Foreman, and Foreman, among other things, was also a general of the New Jersey militia at this time. When Foreman refuses to appear before the legislature, they take away his general's commission. Washington takes away his command of the regiment. So now Foreman is reduced significantly because he no longer commands men. Nonetheless, Foreman reemerges as chair of the Retaliators in 1780, goes and also becomes the Justice of the Court of Common Pleas. As the Justice of the Court of Common Pleas, he takes more provocative actions, including empowering, writing notes to local magistrates, empowering them to confiscate horses of suspected loyalists, including leading a posse of men down the shore and arresting 30 suspected London traders. Foreman suffers more setbacks later in the war. He proposes a number of schemes to George Washington about going across British lines and extracting specie from the British government for counterfeit continental currency. Washington, I think by this time, respects Foreman because Foreman has done a number of favors for the Continental Army, including sending numerous intelligence dispatches, including assisting him in some espionage activities. But Foreman's more abrasive schemes are not accepted. Foreman also gets censured yet again by the New Jersey legislature. And then in the climactic setback, Foreman in 1785, after the war, Foreman and the militia colonel from Shrewsbury, Daniel Hendrickson, rig the county elections. And they are caught. And the New Jersey Assembly overturns the election. And after that, within a couple of years, both Foreman and Hendrickson leave the county. They both go west afterward, disgraced. Next slide, please. All right, let's talk now about local government. I've already done a little of this. Next slide, please. The American Revolution tremendously democratized local government. We have new people gain access to the vote and to office. Requirements to vote dropped to only own 50 acres. If you were landless and poor, you still couldn't vote. Obviously, if you're a woman, you couldn't vote. But nonetheless, the majority of adult males gained the franchise. Remarkable expansion of the franchise. Also, about at least half, and probably more than half, of the pre-war leaders leave government, either because they were loyalists or because, in one way or another, they've fallen from favor. So they leave. That opens up a lot of leadership slots. So a new democratic leadership emerges. 1/3 of the new leaders didn't even own enough land to vote before the war. And of the other leaders, most were yeoman farmers, not big landowners, but yeomen. People who were allowed to vote, but were sort of locked out of leadership positions before the war. There was a sharp decline in incumbency. In the Royal Assembly, from 1769 to 1776, only 3 men served for Monmouth County in the Royal Assembly. In contrast, 17 men served in the state legislature over the next 6-year period. And none of them served for more than 2 consecutive years. A very tumultuous political culture emerges, where between three political blocs: Machiavellian Whigs, due process Whigs, and the disaffected. And I'll talk a little bit about each of them now. Next slide, please. Okay, Machiavellian Whigs centered the township of Freehold, mostly Presbyterian, not exclusively, but mostly. Their big issue was curbing that London trade and forceful retaliation against the enemy. Some of the things that demonstrate their win-at-all-costs attitude: election day coercion. There was coercion at the elections in 1777, 1779, 1780, and as noted, this sort of climactic coercion in 1785. Rigged auctions of confiscated royal estates, and sweeps along the shore when sort of posses of armed men went down the shore and impressed horses and cattle from the shore residents in the belief that it was vulnerable to loyalist attack, but probably linked to the losses that they suffered and were replenishing their own stables. An example of one of these Machiavellians is James Green. He was a tavern keeper and militia captain. He was an active Whig throughout the war. The war was hard on him. You know, one thing I want to note is that this is a hard war for everyone. And he had his horse stolen, and he was captured. When he returns in 1780, he begins aggressively finding the people in his militia company who won't turn out. How am I doing on time? I'm okay? Tell me.
It's about there.
Okay, I'll be quick. 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. Aggressively finding his men leads property confiscations, several incidents where, again, without due process of the law, linked to confiscating private goods. Next slide, please. The due process Whigs, generally Dutch. For them, security for the shore residents and due process of the law were the key issues. There are numerous cases where these folks would support the rights of disaffected in courts. They give affidavits and basically say that I have no evidence against this guy. I don't think he should take stuff. And they were involved in things like arranging prisoner exchanges. They were Whigs, they supported the cause, they served in the militia, they served in the Continental Army, but they also looked to stir a more moderate path. Next slide, please. While all this is going on, disaffected continue to serve in the government, particularly along the shore. These are people who wink at the Royalist activities. In many cases, they participate in illegal trade. An example is Trevor Newland. Newland was the tax assessor for Stafford Township on the shore. While serving in office, he's holding correspondence with the Associated Loyalists, and he's traveling to New York, which is, of course, illegal. And by the way, this is in the early days of the war. This is 1780. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's a continuum. I want to note the continuum. Machiavellian into due process into disaffected. The important thing is to note that loyalists are external to all of this. Loyalists are on the other side. And it was a chaotic and antagonistic groups. Next slide, please. Okay, so last thoughts. Monmouth County was part of a military frontier. Where you have military frontier, you have a lot of upset. Monmouth County may have been one of the bumpier places on the military frontier, but the activities I'm describing were not unique to Monmouth County. To learn more, I encourage you to buy my book. I do have copies in back for $20. I also have a book coming out this June, which focuses in particular on one of the nastier raids of the war, in which the village of Tin Falls was destroyed. And I always like to hear from people, so I do maintain a website, myladelberg.com, and if you ever want to drop your line, just click Hey Mike. Okay? Thanks so much.
You said, of course, it was illegal.
Well, my apologies. New York was held by the British. You were crossing enemy lines to go to New York. You could get a pass from the government. You could get a pass from General Washington. Short of that, and the entry point of Elizabeth, where there were the prisoner of war cartel, you couldn't cross legally. You were breaking the law.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one, I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, where was James Green's Tavern?
James Green owned a tavern in Freehold, and he hosted some Admiralty Court. He hosted some Admiralty Courts there.
Did it go by another name?
No, but I believe it was the same tavern that was owned by Henry Drake, if you also see Drake's Tavern.
Okay.
How many free blacks were there at the beginning of the war? And then how many free blacks at the end of the
war? If you look at the tax lists, the problem is that the tax lists before the war are not extant, do not exist for all the townships. So I can't give you a great answer on that. What I can tell you is if you look at 1778 and 1779, when you do have tax lists, you have about 40 African Americans in the rolls. Now, they're not, most of them are not landowners. They're what are called single men, or they're householders. There are a couple who own small freeholds, but not many. And you have a slight increase, about a 20% increase by the end of the war. So you have more, but one of the reasons why is because the Quakers, through all of this time period, are working very hard to purchase the freedom of slaves and to also shame slaveholders into freeing slaves.
After the war, was there a large exodus of whalers from Monmouth County?
Yeah, I believe I've estimated that the county had about a 10% drop in population. Now, one thing we know about colonial families is they were big, so they reproduced and they filled that number quickly. So the county was not, it wasn't a long time before that population was restored, but yeah, about 10%.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody would like some time to sell his book, too. It's on the table in the back, and I'm sure he'll sign it for you. Also, something I was going to remember, and gosh, it went right out of my head. Anyway, we do have our fella who does the questions and answers. Yeah. So I'll introduce Dick Bushheimer, who's going to give the trivia.
She sleeps with me. Okay, get your thinking caps on. The huge fire that swept New York City on September 21st, 1776, and remember George Washington and the Army had just left, was purportedly the work of patriot arsonists. Was anyone ever charged with that crime?
No.
Who said yes? Okay, you're right. One Abraham Patton, P-A-T-T-E-N, caught while planning to set fire to the British military stores in New Brunswick. Was caught by the British and admitted just before they hanged him that he and several others had indeed caused the New York City fire 9 months earlier, but he died on the scaffold without revealing the names of his accomplices. Here's an interesting one. The song Yankee Doodle was originally of British origin, and it portrayed Americans as boorish bumpkins. What was the meaning of the song's phrase, he stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni?
Macaronis were fops, and so it was a derivative thing that they were outrageous goofballs.
Yeah, that's essentially it. In 18th century London, the term macaroni meant the height of fashion, or chic. Okay, so anything macaroni was really the cat's pajamas. The just-introduced Italian pasta dish, along with all other things Italian, was all the rage in the London of that time. That's kind of interesting. About how many men did George Washington lose to disease at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777? Any idea?
5,000.
No, it's about half of that.
2,000.
About 2,500, there you go. And that, but the significant thing is that it was 1/4 of the troops that Washington led at the time. So he lost 1/4 of his men to disease and causes other than battle wounds. How did General Henry Knox, Washington's artillery chief, acquire his important expertise?
Pretty close.
Exactly right. Knox was a Boston bookseller before the war. He had the bulk of his artillery information from books and then from practical experience. He became an acknowledged expert, so successful that he fought in every major battle in the Northern War. I mean the Northern War, this is the war here in New York and New Jersey. In Boston and Canada too, as a matter of fact. He was responsible for capturing the cannon in Fort Ticonderoga, which successfully drove the British out of Boston a short time later. Right, along with Benedict Arnold. On July 15, 1779, General Anthony Wayne led American troops in a successful bayonet assault upon what British-held fort in the Hudson Valley?
Stony Point.
Stony Point, very good. Box of Snickers for that lady. Stony Point, just below West Point on the Hudson River. He killed or captured the defenders and destroyed its cannon and supplies before departing. But he just simply left the fort and the British reoccupied it a day later. But its usefulness as a fort was gone. To keep the British ships from entering the upper Hudson River, what steps did George Washington take in April of 1778? A chain. He caused a huge chain, 1,500 feet long and 800 links, stretched across the river at West Point, and it worked. Only 13 links of the huge chain survive today, and they surround a monument at the military academy at West Point. Right. In the second phase of the British Hessian invasion of New Jersey on June 23, 1780, did any of the invaders actually enter the Hobart Gap where Route 24 lies today? That's a tough question. No?
Yes, I would guess
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, Colonel Cosmo Gordon, leading elements of the British Coldstream Guards, actually pushed well into the gap until they were repelled by withering rifle fire from New Jersey militiamen. This was as close as the British ever got to Morristown in the American Revolution. What false name did Major John Andre use in his part in the Benedict Arnold conspiracy? Anybody know? Mr. John Anderson. Because he was captured in civilian attire, what happened? How was he? He was hanged instead of firing squad. Right. Only because he was in civilian attire, which Benedict Arnold talked him into. Right. Here's a toughie. 5 delegates representing New Jersey signed the Declaration of Independence. Name any 2. Witherspoon is correct.
Livingston.
No. Richard Stockton is correct. I'm sorry? No. No, Francis Hopkinson. Okay. John Hart. And who was the last one? There's a town in New Jersey named after him.
Clark.
Abraham Clark is correct. You should know these. Well, they are the New Jersey representatives who signed the most important document at that time. All right, this should be very interesting. I don't see how well you do on this. This is the last question. What are the present-day names of the following colonial settlements? Spanktown. Rahway is correct. Connecticut Farms. Union, right. Van Vaten's Bridge.
Bridgewater?
Who? Van Vaten's Bridge. Nope. Okay, you didn't get that one. Finn Durham. I don't even know where Finn Durham is today. Middletown. Middletown, what's the name today?
Same.
It's been changed. No? How about Mountain Brook? Here's one for you. A Quackanock. A Quackanock.
The same.
Right. Quiddletown. Newmarket is right. Broomtown. Broomtown. Florida Park. That's so named because they made brooms. I mean, they did some practical things back then. Here's one, Mendon. M-E-N-D-O-N. Mendon is right. Yeah, they upgraded the name a little bit, now they call it Mendon. Okay. All right, there's only a few more. Paulus Hook. Jersey City is right. They should have left it Paulus Hook. All right, Newark. Newark is right. Okay. I thought I'd get you with that one. Turkeytown. New Providence, that's right. And the last one is Vealtown. Burnersville. Very good. You did very well. Ladies